to review what we're up to here. Page 151. What does the primordial signifier mean? It's clear that it quite precisely means nothing. Now you are aware of what he's after here. Nothing and no thing. Page 185, toward the bottom, just above the number 2. Every real signifier is as such a signifier that signifies nothing. Nothing. Fundamentally important core concept in Lacanian psychoanalysis, and all too often one that's misunderstood. It's tempting and very illuminating to understand nothing in terms of set theory, which we haven't talked much about, and that's just fine. It starts to pop up in here when Lacan refers to the symbolic as a set, on page 183, for instance. A set, a container, a form, a structure, an empty bag, as you'll hear him talk up in Seminar 24. And that's common in set theory. It's an example of a set, or an empty set is like a bag, an empty bag. So he is thinking mathematically here. He is thinking towards topology, as he will in later seminars. But right now in Seminar 3, at the very start of this process, a decade or so before he even gets to that point, he's still thinking in terms of language. And language he's thinking of as a structure that puts you in your place, that positions you in the world, that provides you with, surrounds you with meaning. But first and foremost, your first interaction with the symbolic is not as a positioning force, but as a prohibiting force, one that tells you you're about to be positioned. If you accept this, as most people do and become neurotic, if you accept this, you're going to have to give something up. Thou shalt no longer live without the symbolic. You will always know your place, even when you reject it. Page 250 really starts getting into language as a form, as a structure, the symbolic as a container into which the subject fits. Page 250. Toward the bottom, the nucleus of psychosis. The nucleus of psychosis has to be linked to a relationship between the subject and the signifier in its most formal dimension. That formal dimension that connects the subject and the signifier, the speaker and the word, is a relationship. The formal dimension is a relationship. It's a relationality, a positionality that comes. Whatever the word means, the fact that you're using it shows that you are positioned in a symbolic system. Regardless of the words you're using, the very fact that you are using words shows that you are positioned and positioning within a symbolic structure. That's this formal dimension that he's getting at here. In its dimension as a pure signifier, pure because it is empty. It is strictly formal. It is a form without content. See what he's getting at here? The primordial signifier signifies nothing. It means nothing because it is a form without content. It is a form that points to sheer formality itself. The pure primordial signifier that the psychotic rejects and the neurotic accepts is a signifier that shows that something like signification as a formative form into which you can fit apparatus exists. That is this pure signifier. And that everything constructed around this consists only of effective reactions to the primary phenomenon, the relationship to the signifier. So what's fundamentally signified by the pure signifier, the primordial signifier, is the subject's relationship to the signifier. Now, that is a really tricky thing to wrap your head around. But just think of it this way. Before the child knew the meaning of the words they were hearing words. Before they knew the meaning of the one signifier that they associate most intensely with, their first name, they were hearing it again and again and again addressed to them. And what the parent said, what the primary caregiver did when they used your first name to address you as a child, was not tell you what it means, tell you what you mean, but introduce you to meaning itself. At the level of a relationship, what that word communicated to you, if it communicated anything, was the feeling of care, the feeling of being cared for, or maybe the feeling of being in trouble. Every time you heard your name, it was like first and middle name, and you only felt like people used it when you were in trouble. Regardless, though, it signaled your relationship to society, to a system of rules, to a human being who already knows that system, a primary caregiver. The word doesn't mean anything. The only thing that the signifier signifies at this pure preliminary primordial state is that you, from this day forward, are going to have a relationship with signifiers. It's a strictly formal, connective, relational function. The function of the signifier at this level is strictly formative. Now, what happens when you accept this? When you accept your placement in a world not of your own creation, at the level of language. It's simple, Lacan says at the top of page 250, last line in that paragraph, at the top of 250. If the neurotic inhabits language, the psychotic is inhabited, possessed by language. The neurotic finds themselves in language. They inhabit language. Language becomes the house of their little b being. Language becomes their home. They inhabit language. They accept it as their Lord and Savior, and it welcomes them into itself. Language, society, the symbolic, law and order. The neurotic is somebody who has found their place in that system and accepted it. The psychotic, though, has rejected this. What the psychotic rejects is the positioning authority of language. What they fundamentally reject is the authority of the symbolic to put them in their place. They refuse to allow that to be a part of their existence. Which is why Lacan keeps coming back to that passage from Freud, where Freud says the subject didn't want to know anything about castration, not even at the level of repression. What the psychotic rejects fundamentally are the constraints that language would impose upon them. And as a result, they also reject the positioning authority of language, of society. They never find their place. But notice what happens here. This is Lacan's wager. The neurotic accepts language. They go through Beyahun. They experience castration and alienation. They repress that experience as a symbolic activity, repression. And they get on with their lives as proper ladies and gentlemen. The psychotic, though, rejects that Beyahun. They do not accept the primitive symbolic structuring aspect of life. But notice what happens. The neurotic, as a result, is allowed to inhabit language. But the psychotic, however, is inhabited, possessed by language. So because the psychotic always remains exterior to language, language always remains a threat, something that can intrude upon the psychotic's existence. This is a big turning point in Lacan's thought here. Because the neurotic accepts language and language accepts the neurotic, allowing them to enter it and to find their place there, they're good to go. The psychotic, however, because they reject language, as a structuring, positioning force, language always remains external to them, as something that can threaten them, that can enter them. They're constantly being inhabited by the home in which they refused to find themselves. They don't enter the house enters them. They don't inhabit language. Language comes to inhabit them. It possesses them. It takes them over. And it's not too far of a step from here to get to Lacan's basic wager of analyzing psychosis, of diagnosing psychosis. He says you will always see it emerging at the level of linguistic disturbances. It's at the level of disturbed language use, weird uses of words, strangeness at the level of language, that you start to see signs of psychosis. Because the psychotic's relationship to language is fundamental. It has a screwed up relationship to language, abnormal relative to what usually happens. And that's how you can start to detect it. You can detect psychosis at the level of linguistic disturbance because the psychotic has an original, basic, fundamental, maladaptive relationship to language. It did not accept language. The psychotic did not accept language. It rejected language as a structuring, placing force. And as a result, language is always out there, operating on, entering into the psychotic's life. If the neurotic inhabits language, the psychotic is inhabited, possessed by language, because the psychotic's relationship to language is one of rejection, not acceptance. And language never lets the psychotic forget that.